There is a weight you carry that has no name. It settles in your chest like ancient fog, whispering sorrows that never belonged to you. You feel the unspoken grief of generations, the anger that hides behind polite smiles, the dreams your ancestors abandoned at the threshold of survival. This is not weakness, it is a doorway. A crack in the carefully constructed walls between souls, through which the shadow rivers of the collective unconscious pour their dark and secret waters. You were never meant to carry this alone, yet here you stand, drowning in depths you never dove into, feeling everything, understanding nothing. In today's video, we will explore this topic, diving deeper and deeper into its hidden depths. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. The homecoming that wounds. You return to the place where your story began, the childhood home, now transformed by years and distance, yet somehow unchanged in its essential character. The door opens, and with it comes something invisible, something that settles over your shoulders like a cloak woven from memory and unspoken truths. Within moments, your body knows what your mind has forgotten. The tightening in your chest is not random. The heaviness in your bones is not imagination. This is the language of the body remembering what the psyche has tried to forget, the emotional architecture of a family system that never learned to speak its truth. Your mother moves through practiced cheerfulness, but beneath her smile lives decades of disappointment she could never name. Your father's silence is not empty. It is full, dense with dreams he abandoned, ambitions he buried, desires he learned to call foolish. Your siblings perform their choreographed roles with the precision of dancers who have rehearsed the same movements since childhood, each one playing their part in a drama that no one dares to acknowledge. And you feel it all. This is what the great psychologist Carl Jung understood. You are not simply experiencing emotional sensitivity. You are not merely affected by others' moods. You are participating in something far more profound and far more ancient. You are swimming in the collective unconscious, that vast psychological ocean where families, communities, and entire cultures deposit their unprocessed emotional material, their unlived lives, their unspoken truths. The architecture of consciousness. Jung mapped the terrain of human consciousness like an explorer charting unknown continents. At the surface lies your personal conscious mind, your daily thoughts, your immediate concerns, the awareness you bring to mundane tasks and ordinary conversations. This is the realm of ego, of I think, therefore I am, of the self that believes it is separate and autonomous. But descend deeper, and you encounter your personal unconscious, a shadowy repository of your own repressed memories, your forgotten experiences, the aspects of yourself you learned to hide because they were deemed unacceptable. Here live your individual wounds, your private shames, your secret longings. Yet Jung discovered something more profound still. Beneath the personal unconscious lies a realm that connects you to every other human being. The collective unconscious, a shared psychological space that transcends individual experience. This is not mystical speculation, but psychological reality, confirmed by modern neuroscience's discovery of mirror neurons, the subtle attunement of nervous systems, the micro-expressions and energy cues that human beings process below conscious awareness. But some among us process this collective data with extraordinary precision. Roughly 20% of the population possesses nervous systems calibrated to receive the emotional frequencies that others barely register. These are the highly sensitive, those whose very biology makes them receptors for collective psychological material. You do not choose this absorption. Your nervous system automatically attunes to the emotional field surrounding you, picking up what Jung called complexes, autonomous emotional patterns that operate like independent entities within the psyche, seeking expression, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to remain silent. The complexes that possess us. Jung observed that complexes behave almost like separate personalities within the psyche. They carry their own emotional charge, pursue their own agenda, influence behavior from behind the curtain of consciousness. In healthy individuals, these complexes remain manageable, integrated into the larger personality structure. But in family systems where certain emotions are forbidden, where anger must never be expressed, where grief goes unacknowledged, where fear is treated as weakness, these complexes grow in power and hunger. They seek expression through the most sensitive members of the family, those whose nervous systems cannot filter out the psychological static. This is why you might leave a family gathering feeling inexplicably enraged, though nothing overtly upsetting occurred. You are not simply picking up surface emotions. You are resonating with accumulated emotional complexes that your family system has never integrated. The unlived life of generations, seeking consciousness through your receptive psyche. When your mother suppresses decades of anger about opportunities denied her, that anger does not simply vanish in a psychological ether. It becomes a complex, an autonomous force seeking expression. And often, that expression comes through you, the sensitive one, the feeling one, the one whose boundaries between self and other are more permeable than most. You become what Jung might call a symptom bearer, the individual who manifests the psychological disease of the entire collective. You carry the depression that belongs to your family's collective grief. You express the anxiety that stems from generational trauma. You embody the shame about secrets buried long before your birth. The trap of false responsibility. Here is where most highly sensitive souls become lost in a labyrinth of confusion. They assume this absorption is personal. They believe these overwhelming emotions belong to their individual history. They exhaust themselves trying to process psychological material that has nothing to do with their own life story. They develop anxiety disorders, depression, chronic fatigue, not from their own wounds primarily, but from carrying the undigested emotional content of entire family systems across multiple generations. Jung had a name for this phenomenon: participation mystique, an unconscious identification with collective psychological content that creates the illusion of personal responsibility for universal patterns. When you feel guilty about your father's unexpressed disappointment, you are not experiencing your own authentic guilt. You are participating mystique with a family complex passed down through generations like an inheritance of invisible wounds. This participation begins in childhood, when your developing nervous system learns to attune to the emotional atmosphere as a survival mechanism. All children absorb their caregiver's emotional states. This is how we learn to navigate the world safely. But in highly sensitive children, this absorption becomes so complete that they lose connection to their own authentic emotional responses. You learn to feel anxious when your mother felt threatened, even when you were perfectly safe. You learn to carry shame about family secrets too complex for a child's understanding. You learn to suppress your own needs to maintain emotional equilibrium for adults who could not regulate their own inner states. This is not conscious manipulation by your caregivers. It is an unconscious family system seeking balance through its most receptive member, you. The birth of the false self. Jung understood that this early conditioning creates what he called a false personality, an adaptive self that develops to meet the emotional needs of the environment rather than express authentic individual nature. For highly sensitive people, this false personality often crystallizes into the role of family healer, emotional caretaker, the one who maintains harmony at the cost of their own psychological development. These roles seem noble, even spiritual, but they prevent the development of authentic selfhood. The tragedy deepens when this caretaking role goes unacknowledged or, worse, is pathologized. Highly sensitive family members are often labeled too emotional, difficult, or unstable, precisely because they are carrying and expressing the emotions that others in the system refuse to face. They become the identified patient, the problem child, the one who needs fixing, when in reality, they are the only one brave enough, or cursed enough, to feel the truth of the family's collective shadow. Beyond the family, the wider web. This pattern does not end with family systems. Highly sensitive people find themselves in friend groups, romantic partnerships, and work environments where they unconsciously assume the role of emotional processor for the entire collective. They feel responsible for maintaining harmony, resolving conflicts, ensuring everyone's needs are met. They exhaust themselves carrying unspoken tensions, unexpressed grief, unacknowledged fears, the emotional detritus of entire communities. But here Jung offers a radical reframe. What if this is not pathology? What if some individuals serve an archetypal function within collective systems, not by choice, but by psychological design? What if your sensitivity is not a burden to overcome, but a capacity to understand and work with consciously? Jung believed certain individuals serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious layers of collective experience. They do not choose this role. It emerges from the intersection of innate sensitivity and the psychological needs of their community. But without understanding this function, they become overwhelmed by material never meant to be processed individually. The first step, recognition. Transformation begins with a single, radical recognition. Much of what you have been carrying does not belong to your personal psychological history. That anxiety crushing your chest might be your grandmother's unprocessed trauma from war. That depression weighing on your soul might be your family's collective grief about opportunities lost to poverty or prejudice. That persistent sense of unworthiness might be generations of shame about social status, illegitimacy, or family secrets locked in silence. This recognition does not minimize your experience, it contextualizes it. The question shifts from what is wrong with me to what am I carrying that belongs to someone else? Instead of trying to heal emotions disproportionate to your actual life circumstances, you begin learning to differentiate between personal and collective psychological material. Jung called this lifelong journey individuation, the process of separating your authentic self from the roles, projections, and expectations others have placed upon you. For highly sensitive people, individuation requires learning to witness collective emotional content without automatically absorbing it. It demands developing what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others while maintaining clear boundaries between self and other. This is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about becoming consciously sensitive, understanding how your nervous system processes collective emotional information and learning to work with that capacity skillfully rather than being overwhelmed by it. The shadow, personal and collective. To understand how sensitivity operates within collective systems, we must explore one of Jung's most crucial discoveries, the shadow. Not just the personal shadow, but the vast accumulated shadow of families, communities, cultures, and humanity itself. Your personal shadow consists of the parts of yourself you have learned to hide, deny, or repress. The anger forbidden in childhood. The sexuality taught to be shameful. The creativity abandoned to fit social expectations. The vulnerability armored against rejection. These disowned aspects do not disappear when pushed into unconsciousness. They form complexes that influence behavior from behind the scenes, pulling strings you cannot see, making choices you believe are conscious but are actually compulsive. But Jung discovered something more profound. Groups also have shadows. Families have collective shadows composed of all the emotions, truths, and experiences the family system cannot acknowledge. Financial shame, addiction, mental illness, sexual abuse. These topics become unspeakable, not necessarily secret, but energetically charged in ways that make honest discussion impossible. Communities and cultures carry even larger shadows. American culture bears a massive shadow around racism, indigenous genocide, economic inequality. European cultures carry shadows of colonialism and world wars. Every culture has collective shadows around power, sexuality, spirituality, and death. As a highly sensitive person, you do not encounter these shadows intellectually. You feel them in your body. You absorb them into your nervous system. You carry them as if they were your own psychological material. This is why highly sensitive people often struggle with anxiety, depression, or physical symptoms that seem disproportionate to their personal life circumstances. They are processing collective shadow material without realizing it. The shadow seeks expression. Jung understood that repressed shadow material does not simply disappear. It gains autonomy and seeks expression through the most receptive members of the collective. This is why you might feel inexplicably angry about social injustices you have not personally experienced. Why you carry deep grief about environmental destruction or species extinction. Why you feel overwhelmed by the suffering of strangers across the globe. This is not emotional instability, it is shadow reception. Your nervous system picks up on collective emotional fields around issues your family, community, or culture has pushed into unconsciousness. You feel the accumulated pain, rage, and grief that generations have been unable to process. But here is where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. Shadow material is not evil or pathological. It is unlived life, the aspects of human experience that have been denied, rejected, or suppressed. Within every shadow complex lies not just pain but also power, creativity, and vitality cut off from conscious expression. The collective shadow around sexuality contains not just shame and repression, but also erotic energy, creative life force, and sacred intimacy that could transform relationships if consciously integrated. The collective shadow around anger contains not just rage and violence, but also righteous passion for justice, healthy boundary setting, and the energy needed for necessary change. As a highly sensitive person, you do not just absorb the painful aspects of collective shadow. You also have access to the creative potential within it. This is why highly sensitive people often become artists, healers, activists, or spiritual teachers. They are unconsciously driven to transform absorbed shadow material into something useful for collective consciousness. Active imagination, the key to transformation. But this transformation cannot happen unconsciously. Jung discovered that shadow integration requires active imagination, consciously engaging with shadow material through creative expression, dream work, or therapeutic exploration rather than simply being overwhelmed by it. For highly sensitive people, this means learning to work with absorbed shadow material as raw material for creative and healing work rather than carrying it as personal burden. The family trauma you absorbed might become the foundation for therapeutic work, helping others heal generational patterns. The cultural shame around mental illness you carried might drive advocacy for mental health awareness. The collective grief about environmental destruction that overwhelms you might inspire environmental activism or education. This transformation from passive absorption to active creation is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to transform conflict and suffering into new forms of consciousness. Highly sensitive people have natural access to this function because they feel collective shadow material so intensely. But they need ego strength and conscious awareness to work with it skillfully. Jung observed that individuals who successfully integrate shadow material do not just heal themselves, they contribute to healing the collective unconscious. Every person who transforms personal and collective shadow into conscious awareness makes it easier for others to do the same work. This is why individual psychological development is never purely personal. It is a contribution to the evolution of human consciousness. The dark night of the soul. Shadow integration is not comfortable. Jung famously wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For highly sensitive people, this means facing not just your own darkness, but the accumulated darkness of families, communities, and cultures. Many highly sensitive people experience what Jung called the dark night of the soul, periods of intense psychological crisis when shadow material becomes too powerful to ignore. These crises often feel like mental illness, but Jung understood them as initiatory experiences forcing the development of new levels of consciousness. The key is approaching shadow material with what Jung called conscious suffering, facing darkness with awareness and intention rather than being unconsciously consumed by it. This requires developing an ego strong enough to hold difficult emotions without being destroyed by them, while remaining open to the transformative potential within the shadow. For highly sensitive people, conscious suffering means learning to feel collective pain without taking personal responsibility for fixing it. It means allowing yourself to be moved by injustice, trauma, and suffering while maintaining enough psychological stability to to transform that emotion into useful action. It means becoming a vessel for shadow transformation rather than a victim of shadow absorption. The role of sensitivity in our time. Jung believed the modern world is experiencing an eruption of collective shadow material that can no longer be contained by traditional religious and cultural structures. We see this in political polarization, environmental crisis, social unrest, and the mental health epidemic. The old methods of keeping shadow material unconscious are failing. This is where highly sensitive people play a crucial role. You are the early warning system for collective shadow eruption. You feel psychological pressure building in collective systems before it becomes obvious to others. Your breakdowns often precede cultural breakthroughs. Your personal healing work contributes to collective shadow integration that prevents more destructive forms of shadow expression. But this role requires understanding and support. Highly sensitive people need to know their psychological struggles often reflect collective shadow dynamics rather than personal pathology. They need tools for working consciously with absorbed shadow material. They need communities that understand and value their function rather than pathologizing their sensitivity. Individuation, becoming who you are. The transformation from unconscious shadow absorption to conscious shadow work is perhaps the most crucial developmental task for highly sensitive people. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of differentiating your authentic self from the collective psychological material you have been carrying. But individuation for highly sensitive people is complicated by their natural porosity to collective emotional fields. Traditional approaches to psychological development focus on strengthening ego boundaries and developing personal autonomy. While these skills are important, highly sensitive people also need to learn to maintain conscious connection to collective psychological dynamics without being overwhelmed by them. Jung understood that complete psychological isolation is neither possible nor desirable. We are social beings embedded in collective psychological fields that shape consciousness in profound ways. The goal is not to disconnect from these fields, but to engage with them consciously rather than being unconsciously invaded by them. Conscious empathy, the crucial skill. This begins with developing conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others while maintaining awareness of your own separate psychological boundaries. Most highly sensitive people operate in unconscious empathy, automatically absorbing others' emotional states without realizing it is happening. Conscious empathy involves recognizing when you are feeling someone else's emotions and choosing how to respond rather than being automatically overwhelmed. The first step is learning to notice when your emotional state shifts in response to external influences. Start paying attention to how you feel before and after interacting with different people or entering different environments. Notice if your mood changes dramatically around certain family members, coworkers, or friends. These shifts often indicate you are absorbing emotional information from the collective field rather than experiencing your own authentic emotions. Holding the tension of opposites. Jung emphasized the importance of holding the tension of opposites, the psychological capacity to feel conflicting emotions or experiences without immediately trying to resolve the discomfort. For highly sensitive people, this means learning to hold the tension between feeling collective emotional material and maintaining your own psychological center. When you notice you have absorbed someone else's anxiety, instead of immediately trying to calm yourself or fix their problem, practice simply observing the experience. Notice where you feel the anxiety in your body. Notice any thoughts or impulses that arise. Notice how it feels different from your own authentic emotional responses. This conscious observation creates psychological space between you and the absorbed material. Jung discovered that psychological material becomes less powerful when brought into conscious awareness. Shadow complexes thrive in unconsciousness, where they operate autonomously without being questioned. But when you observe them consciously, they lose some of their compulsive power over behavior. Active imagination and practice. This observation process requires active imagination, consciously engaging with psychological material through imagery, dialogue, or creative expression rather than being passively overwhelmed by it. When you feel overwhelmed by absorbed emotions, try imagining them as separate entities you can dialogue with. You might visualize the anxiety absorbed from your mother as a worried child who needs reassurance, but is not your responsibility to parent. You might imagine the anger picked up from a coworker as a fire that belongs to them, not to you. You might see the depression absorbed from your family system as a heavy coat you can consciously choose to remove and return to its rightful owner. This is not merely psychological visualization. It is a real process of differentiation that helps your nervous system recognize what belongs to you and what you have absorbed from others. Jung observed that the psyche responds to symbolic and imaginal work as powerfully as it responds to literal experience. Working creatively with shadow material. As you develop skill in conscious observation and active imagination, you can begin working with absorbed shadow material more creatively. Instead of simply trying to eliminate difficult emotions, you can explore what they are trying to communicate. Shadow material often contains important information about collective dynamics needing attention. The anxiety you absorb from your workplace might reveal systemic problems needing to be addressed. The grief you feel about environmental destruction might point toward necessary action. The anger you pick up from social injustice might call you toward advocacy or activism. The shame inherited from family systems might highlight patterns needing to be healed across generations. Jung believed that individuals who learn to work consciously with shadow material become agents of collective healing. They do not just process shadow material for themselves. They transform it in ways that benefit the entire collective system. This transformation happens through the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to create something new from the tension between opposing forces. For highly sensitive people, the transcendent function involves taking the raw material of absorbed shadow and transforming it into creative expression, healing work, or conscious action, building ego strength. But this transformation requires ego strength, the psychological capacity to hold difficult experiences without being destroyed by them. Highly sensitive people often have underdeveloped egos because they learned early to prioritize others' needs over their own psychological development. They became so skilled at absorbing and processing collective material that they never developed strong individual identities. Ego development for highly sensitive people involves learning to say no to carrying others' emotional burdens, even when this disappoints or upsets them. It means developing your own interests, opinions, and goals rather than constantly adapting to others' expectations. It means learning to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood or disapproved of when you set healthy boundaries. This ego development does not mean becoming selfish or disconnected. Jung understood that healthy individuation actually enhances your capacity for genuine relationship because you are no longer unconsciously seeking others to complete your psychological development. When you have a strong sense of your own identity, you can choose to engage with collective dynamics consciously rather than being unconsciously compelled to absorb whatever emotional material is available. Opus contra naturam, working against nature. Jung also emphasized the importance of opus contra naturam, work against nature, or the conscious effort to resist unconscious patterns. For highly sensitive people, this means actively resisting the automatic tendency to absorb others' emotions and instead choosing when and how to engage empathically. This might mean leaving family gatherings when you notice you are becoming overwhelmed by collective dynamics. It might mean limiting exposure to news and social media when you recognize you are absorbing collective anxiety about world events. It might mean choosing friends and romantic partners who have done their own emotional work rather than unconsciously seeking relationships where you can play the familiar role of emotional caretaker. The goal is not to become insensitive or disconnected. The goal is to transform unconscious sensitivity into conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others when you choose to while maintaining clear boundaries around your own psychological well-being. The wounded healer archetype. As highly sensitive people learn to work consciously with shadow material, many discover they embody what Jung called the wounded healer archetype, individuals whose personal wounds become sources of healing wisdom for others. This ancient pattern appears across cultures and throughout history, from shamanic traditions to modern therapeutic practice. The wounded healer is not someone who has transcended suffering, but someone who has learned to transform wounds into wisdom. Jung understood that our deepest wounds often correspond to our greatest gifts, not despite our pain, but because of how we learn to work with it consciously. For highly sensitive people, the wound often involves years of carrying collective psychological material without understanding what was happening. The experience of feeling too much, of being overwhelmed by emotions not belonging to them, of exhausting themselves trying to heal others while neglecting their own needs. These experiences create profound understanding of psychological boundaries and the difference between empathy and absorption. This understanding becomes healing medicine for others struggling with similar patterns. The wounded healer's dilemma. But Jung warned about the wounded healer's dilemma, the tendency to become so identified with the helper role that you never complete your own healing journey. Many highly sensitive people get trapped in careers or relationships where they are constantly giving but never receiving the deep understanding and support they need for their own psychological development. This dilemma arises because the wounded healer archetype can become another form of the same pattern that created the original wound, taking responsibility for others' psychological well-being while neglecting your own needs. The highly sensitive person might become a therapist working with trauma clients all day, then go home and absorb their family's unprocessed emotions all evening. They have transformed their sensitivity into professional skill, but have not learned to protect themselves from ongoing psychological absorption. Jung emphasized that authentic wounded healers must continue their own individuation process even as they help others. This means maintaining practices that support your own psychological development, seeking your own therapy or healing work, and regularly examining whether your helping relationships are balanced exchanges or unconscious reenactments of childhood caretaking patterns. The healing presence. The mature wounded healer understands that healing work happens as much through who they are as through what they do. Jung observed that authentic healing occurs through constellating psychological material in others, activating their own capacity for growth and integration rather than trying to fix their problems directly. For highly sensitive people, this means learning to trust that your integrated presence is healing in itself. When you have learned to feel deeply without being overwhelmed, to witness suffering without taking it on as personal responsibility, to maintain compassion without losing boundaries, your very way of being demonstrates that conscious sensitivity is possible. This modeling effect is often more powerful than any advice or technique you might offer. People unconsciously recognize when they are in the presence of someone who has integrated their sensitivity skillfully, and this recognition activates their own possibility for similar integration. Avoiding archetypal inflation. But the wounded healer archetype also comes with what Jung called archetypal inflation, the danger of identifying so completely with the helper role that you lose touch with your own humanity. Highly sensitive people can become addicted to being needed, deriving their sense of worth from how much they can help others rather than from their intrinsic value as individuals. This inflation often shows up as subtle forms of superiority, believing you understand others better than they understand themselves, feeling frustrated when people do not follow your guidance, or becoming resentful when your help is not appreciated. These reactions indicate you are unconsciously using the helper role to meet your own unmet needs for recognition, control, or significance. Jung's solution to archetypal inflation was holding the tension, remaining conscious of both your archetypal function and your personal humanity. This means acknowledging that while you may have developed wisdom through wounding, you are still a fallible human being with ongoing psychological work to do. It also means recognizing that not everyone needs or wants your help, and that your value as a person is not determined by how much healing you can facilitate for others. The mature wounded healer can offer gifts freely while also accepting rejection, disinterest, or even criticism without taking it personally. Cultural consciousness. Jung believed the wounded healer archetype is particularly important during times of collective crisis when traditional healing methods prove inadequate for addressing widespread psychological suffering. Highly sensitive people who have learned to transform their own shadow absorption into conscious healing work become bridges between individual therapy and collective healing. They understand from personal experience how individual symptoms often reflect collective psychological dynamics. They can help others recognize when anxiety, depression, or relational difficulties stem from absorbed family trauma, cultural shadow material, or collective environmental grief. They can teach the skills of psychological differentiation that most therapists never learned because they were not trained to understand collective psychological dynamics. But this broader healing work requires cultural consciousness, understanding how personal psychological patterns connect to larger social, political, and spiritual issues. The wounded healer must become capable of seeing individual suffering within the context of collective shadow dynamics without losing compassion for the individual's experience. This might mean helping clients understand how their family's addiction patterns connect to larger cultural issues around trauma, spirituality, and social support systems. It might mean recognizing how individual anxiety disorders often reflect collective uncertainty about environmental and economic sustainability. It might mean seeing how personal relationship difficulties connect to cultural shadows around gender, sexuality, and power dynamics. Living as a bridge between worlds. The ultimate integration for highly sensitive people involves learning to live as what Jung called a bridge between the worlds, maintaining conscious connection to both individuals' psychological development and collective unconscious dynamics. This is not a role you choose as much as a capacity you develop through understanding and working skillfully with your natural sensitivity. Living as a conscious bridge means accepting that you will always be more permeable to collective psychological fields than most people. Your nervous system is designed to pick up on subtle emotional information that others miss. Your dreams often contain material that extends beyond your personal unconscious into collective themes and symbols. Your intuitive responses frequently provide information about situations and relationships that logic alone cannot explain. Instead of seeing this permeability as burden or pathology, you learn to work with it as a form of collective intelligence. You become skilled at sensing when family systems are under stress, when work environments are becoming toxic, when communities are processing grief or anger, when cultural tensions are building toward crisis points. This sensitivity makes you valuable as a friend, colleague, family member, and community participant, not because you fix these situations, but because you can feel and reflect what is happening before it becomes obvious to others. Differentiated consciousness. But living as a conscious bridge also requires exceptional skill in psychological boundary management. You must learn to feel collective material without automatically absorbing it into your own psychological system. This means developing what Jung called differentiated consciousness, the capacity to maintain clear awareness of what belongs to your individual experience and what you are picking up from the collective field around you. This differentiation happens through consistent practice of conscious observation. Throughout each day, you check in with your own emotional and physical state. You notice when your mood shifts in response to interactions with others or exposure to different environments. You distinguish between emotions arising from your own life circumstances and those that seem disproportionate to your actual situation. When you notice you have absorbed collective material, you practice conscious return, acknowledging what you have absorbed and consciously returning it to its source. This might involve visualization where you imagine the absorbed emotion as light or energy that you send back to the person or system it belongs to. It might involve verbal acknowledgement. I notice I am carrying anxiety that belongs to my colleague. I return this anxiety with compassion and release it from my system. The key is approaching this process with love rather than rejection. Jung understood that shadow material seeks consciousness, not elimination. When you return absorbed emotions to their source, you are not rejecting or judging the people who unconsciously projected them onto you. You are simply maintaining healthy psychological boundaries while holding compassion for their struggle. Appropriate detachment. Living as a conscious bridge also means learning to offer your perceptive gifts without forcing them on others. Not everyone wants to see themselves clearly or understand the collective dynamics they are participating in. Your role is to be available as a clear mirror for those who are ready for deeper self-awareness while respecting others' right to remain unconscious if that is what they choose. This requires developing what Jung called appropriate detachment, caring about others without becoming attached to specific outcomes for their development. You can offer gentle reflections about what you observe in relationships or situations, but you do not take responsibility for whether people act on these insights. Your gift is seeing and reflecting, not controlling or fixing, contributing to collective evolution. Jung believed that individuals who learn to live as conscious bridges make essential contributions to collective psychological evolution. They serve as early warning systems for collective shadow eruption, sensing when families, communities, or cultures are carrying more unconscious material than they can safely contain. They also serve as models for conscious shadow integration, demonstrating that it is possible to feel deeply and live fully without being overwhelmed by collective psychological dynamics. Perhaps most importantly, conscious bridges help create what Jung called cultural containers, social spaces where difficult emotions and truths can be held and processed rather than projected onto scapegoats or acted out destructively. When highly sensitive people learn to witness collective shadow material without becoming overwhelmed by it, they create permission for others to acknowledge and work with their own psychological darkness. Your sensitivity as gift. Your sensitivity was never meant to be eliminated or transcended. It was meant to be developed into conscious skill that serves both your individual development and collective healing. When you learn to feel without absorbing, to witness without carrying, to reflect without fixing, you become a gift to everyone whose life you touch. The world needs your tears, your tenderness, your capacity to feel what others cannot or will not feel. But it needs these gifts offered consciously, with clear boundaries and mature wisdom. Your greatest sensitivity, integrated with understanding and skill, becomes your greatest strength and your deepest contribution to human consciousness. The path of conscious suffering. This is not comfortable work. Jung warned that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires conscious suffering. For highly sensitive people, this means feeling collective pain without numbing yourself to it while also not taking personal responsibility for healing it. It means standing at the intersection of individual and collective consciousness with an open heart and clear boundaries. But this conscious suffering is also conscious creation. Every time you transform absorbed shadow material into wisdom, art, healing work, or compassionate action, you contribute to the evolution of human consciousness. You demonstrate that sensitivity and strength can coexist, that feeling deeply and living fully are not contradictory, that individual healing and collective transformation are intimately connected. Your journey as cultural healing, your journey from unconscious absorption to conscious witness is not just personal development, it is cultural healing. Your transformation from wounded absorber to skilled bridge builder serves not just your own psychological liberation, but the collective awakening that Jung believed was essential for human survival. You were born to be a mirror, a bridge, a translator of collective psychological material. When you embrace this function consciously, your greatest vulnerability becomes your greatest gift. Your deepest wound becomes your clearest wisdom. Your most painful sensitivity becomes your most powerful contribution to healing in a world that desperately needs conscious witness to its own psychological truth. Daily practice, integrating the insights. But understanding these concepts intellectually is only the beginning. Real transformation requires integrating these insights into daily practice, developing concrete skills for living as a conscious bridge between individual and collective psychological reality. Start each day with what Jung would recognize as a form of active imagination, consciously connecting with your own authentic emotional state before engaging with others. Take 5 minutes to sit quietly and notice what you are feeling in your body. What thoughts are arising naturally? What emotional tone characterizes your inner landscape? This baseline awareness becomes your reference point for recognizing when you have absorbed material from others throughout the day. Empathic differentiation. As you move through interactions with family, friends, colleagues, or even strangers in public spaces, practice empathic differentiation. When you notice a shift in your emotional state during or after social contact, pause and ask, "Is this mine? Or am I feeling something that belongs to someone else?" Notice if the emotion matches your actual life circumstances or if it seems disproportionate or disconnected from your personal experience. Jung emphasized that psychological material becomes less autonomous when brought into conscious awareness through language. When you recognize that you have absorbed someone else's anxiety, anger, or sadness, name it explicitly. "I notice I am feeling John's frustration about his work situation," or "I am carrying the worry that my mother feels about my sister." This naming creates psychological distance between you and the absorbed material. Holding the tension. Practice holding the tension, allowing difficult emotions to exist without immediately trying to resolve, fix, or eliminate them. When you feel collective grief about environmental destruction, do not rush to action or despair. Sit with the grief, consciously allowing it to inform you without overwhelming you. When you absorb family anxiety about financial security, resist the urge to either take responsibility for fixing the problem or numbing yourself to the discomfort. Rituals of conscious return. Develop rituals for conscious return, deliberately releasing absorbed emotional material back to its source. This might involve visualization exercises where you imagine the absorbed emotion as light, energy, or symbolic objects that you consciously return to their rightful owner.